There is nothing democratic about being born. You have no control over the time and place where you enter this world. You have to accept your name. My parents, Catholics, called me Shane Paul, the middle name in honor of Saint Paul. Birth also imposes nationality, religion, language, culture, and family. The worst thing about being born on January the 25th, 1955, was not the extreme cold and snow. No, the worst thing was being born in the city of Derry to an Irish Catholic and nationalist family. 14 years before, the IRA began a new campaign to drive the British out of Ireland. I was born simultaneously in two places. Catholic nationalists call my city by its Irish name, Derry. Protestant Unionist pro-British people call it by its British name, Londonderry. So the name of my city was problematic. Derry was a city which had a Catholic nationalist majority, but it was controlled by a powerful Protestant Unionist minority who used gerrymander to seize and maintain power. That situation was not going to last forever, and I was born just in time for the horrible change. So, I say procreation is like a revolution. There is nothing democratic about it. When I was just 5 years old, I was playing with my childhood Protestant friend Scully. One day, out of the blue, he said to me, "You're a Catholic. You worship the Virgin Mary. You're going to burn in hell forever." I was pretty shocked by this extreme rejection. It was at this time I began to read some simple history books about Ireland. It was a discovery of the tragedies of Irish history that caused my early desire to join the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Unjust British rule, mass emigration, the potato famine in the 19th century, our struggle for independence, and the terrible Irish Civil War. All of these things that I just read about gave me a passionate conviction that we Catholics had a just cause to see a united Ireland and the end to British occupation and borders forever. In fact, one day when I was 10 years old, I wrote on a piece of paper, "I, Shane Paul O'Doherty, when I grow up, I want to fight and if necessary die for the freedom of Ireland." I hid this simple piece of paper under a floorboard in the attic where, almost 15 years later, police found my childish scribble. But it was really like a premonition. The childhood patriotism I felt, along with my reading of history, absolutely convinced me that one day I would be a part of a struggle in another IRA campaign to free Ireland. In fact, I was already becoming predisposed to martyrdom and heroism of an IRA kind. However, fate was already planning to give us a struggle, and the first clear signs of this coming were in 1966. The Ulster Volunteer Force shot dead 2 Roman Catholics because they were Catholic. This paramilitary Protestant organization was showing that in 1966, life in Northern Ireland could not only supply Catholics with job discrimination, mass emigration, second-class citizenship, but also execution as enemies of Protestant Ulster. Later, the Ulster Volunteer Force placed and exploded the first bombs in Northern Ireland, aimed against the Protestant Prime Minister, who was trying to make better relations with the Irish Republic and also better relations with Catholics in Northern Ireland. In Derry and in other areas of Northern Ireland, the first protest movement began. This led to street protests which quickly became violent. They were violently repressed by the Protestant police force. Shortly after, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement was formed. It was in imitation of the American Civil Rights Movement, inspired by Martin Luther King. But the Civil Rights Movement with mass street protests didn't realize that it was not only going to promote civil rights for Catholics, it was going to shake the very government of Northern Ireland to its unjust foundations. By 1968, when I was 13, civil rights demonstrations were very frequent, and they were constantly oppressed by armed police, CS gas. There were terrible riots all around the city, particularly near where I lived. Suddenly, law and order in the city was breaking down. There was almost total civil chaos. Things were so bad by 1969 that thousands and thousands of British soldiers were put on the streets of Derry to maintain order. We welcomed the soldiers because they defended us from the Protestant police and Protestant government and Protestant paramilitary police force. However, within a year or two, soldiers began to shoot dead young Catholic rioters. Everybody was looking for the IRA. I was 15, and I was walking to school one day when my best friend said, "Do you want to join the IRA tomorrow evening?" I just said, "Yeah, sure, let's do it." The next evening, we met some guys in a flat in the city centre, and they said, "Are you sure you want to join the IRA? You may lose your life. You may lose your life fighting for Ireland. You may spend your life in prison. You can be blown up, shot. You can be tortured, interrogated. Do you understand what you're getting into?" Of course we didn't. We were 15 years of age. We were sworn into the IRA. Really, we were child soldiers. Within a short time, they had us planting incendiary devices. They trained us in guns, old guns, small guns. And we went out on the streets against highly trained British Army soldiers who had tanks and helicopters and all kinds of weapons. Here we were, 15 years of age, firing small guns at patrols of British soldiers. I remember the first time in a riot, we sneaked up to a police station where a young British soldier was standing holding a rifle. He was probably half asleep. Two of us ran up close to him. I pulled out the gun and I fired as many of the 6 shots as I could. And it was exciting to have been in action like in a movie, and some young girls saw us running away and we felt we were heroes, heroes for Ireland. One evening, 2 IRA men rang the doorbell of my house in this nice Protestant neighborhood and said, "We can't get the bomb to this house. Can you store it in your house in the back garage or somewhere until we can try again?" I said, sure, I can do this. I didn't even know what a bomb was. That night, about 2 a.m., I went to the garage and I saw a fuse with some matches around it. I took the bomb to the front of the building, got a box of matches, struck the matches on the fuse, saw it light, and I ran like hell. I was in bed when this massive explosion rocked the city. Everybody in Derry heard it. It was the first big bomb in the city. Next day, the IRA were asking, who planted the bomb? And later, I came to an IRA safe house and said, I planted the bomb. And while they were angry that I did this without permission, they were delighted they had a young volunteer who was willing to be active, who was unafraid, and that was me. I was willing to be active, and I wasn't afraid. I was too crazy and too young to be afraid. After this, I became the only volunteer who wanted to work with explosives. And soon after, I'm making truck bombs that destroyed Derry, city centre. Then I'm doing booby traps. Then I was making landmines on the border. I invented letter bombs for the IRA. I was sent to London alone to bomb London for a summer. I was 18 years of age. I made letter bombs and sent them. They were the first letter bombs ever in Britain. One went into 10 Downing Street, one blew up a general, one went to the stock exchange, one went to judges, generals. I even got a bomb to the Home Secretary who was in charge when 13 people were murdered on Bloody Sunday. I blew him up. Suddenly this was the biggest news. Radio, television, newspapers. The IRA was delighted. It had London brought to its knees for one young volunteer. So in the newspapers in London, I was described as the babyface bomber. I planted bombs at tube stations. I planted some bombs on cars in the city centre, some shops, but the letter bombs were taking most of the headlines. I came back to Ireland and I was bombing on the border. Then I was bombing in Derry. Soon I had been bombing for 4 or 5 years, and I was most wanted man in London and most wanted man in Northern Ireland after the London bombings. Living like this was both exciting and fearful. You were always excited with adrenaline. Each day you were fighting possibly for the last day. You could be dead by nighttime. Each morning you were fearful, but soon when you were involved in action, you were filled with adrenaline. The patriotism continued, but something new had entered. Something new entered, which was the horror of war, injuring civilians. Some letter bombs injured innocent people. Some bombs injured innocent people, children, women. And there was a crisis of patriotism, a crisis of action, a crisis of innocent civilians, but always the need to serve the IRA and serve the struggle. So we came to 1975, and there was a big ceasefire between the IRA and the British government. Everybody could go home in December 1974. After 4 or 5 months, I went home, and I was only there a matter of hours, and a police patrol arrested me. Within a few months, I was released and taken to London, only to face the serious charges of London bombings. I was given 30 life sentences and 20 years. I went into prison, refused to wear a criminal uniform, was naked in solitary for 15 months. There was a huge crisis in my mind about war, justice, peace, human rights, prisoners' rights. I had a terrible argument one day with a Jesuit priest, shouting, "Where's the proof your God exists?" And he answered me as he left my cell, "Why, the four Gospels, of course." So I demanded a copy of the four Gospels. I read the four Gospels in one evening. I had a noble cause. I had a sacred cause, but it was a political cause using violence. And in support of my cause, I was prepared to injure or kill. Suddenly, I'm reading about this other revolutionary who only used peaceful means. He had a divine cause, a sacred cause, didn't use any violence, was prepared to suffer more than to enact violence or hurt people. But I was horribly convicted by my conscience over the injuries to human beings, the injustices I had caused in trying to cure injustices. I had caused more injustices than I had cured. But my conscience became like a huge pain to me. And I discovered something that I hadn't thought about, sin, injustice. I read a paragraph by a Jesuit that sin had three consequences. It divided you from people, and I was in solitary confinement. It divided you from yourself, and I had terrible problems of conscience. And it divided you from God, or the idea of God. And I felt that I had cut myself off from God. And my thinking was I had to restore relations with people through apologizing. I had to restore relations with myself, admitting I was wrong. And I had to restore relations with a sense of God by being just to people, by apologizing. So from solitary confinement, as the hero in prison, suddenly I left solitary confinement and asked to write letters of apology to my victims. Everybody thought this was a joke. The British government, the police, the prison system, the prisoners, the IRA prisoners, everybody thought this guy has gone mad. But I fought a campaign for a year and I wrote letters of apology to my victims. I published a letter in the Irish newspapers saying, "Call off the war." Everybody thought I was crazy, friends, family. But I made a decision not to give my life to the IRA forever, but to take my life back, take control of my life and become my own person, making my own decisions, following my own beliefs. It was a dangerous time. Some persons in the IRA in prison threatened me, threatened to kill me. The majority of IRA prisoners ignored me for the next 8 years. Even though I was not in solitary confinement, I entered more solitary confinement because nobody would speak to me. I was the person that no one would speak to in prison. I spent 14 and a half years in prison. Then I was released to go to university. And I went on the media and was the first voice in Northern Ireland saying, "Call off the war. Stop the war in the name of the people, in the name of human rights, respect for life, respect for citizens, no matter what their religion or nationality." So my voice caught some people. I spoke to members of the IRA, interviewed them for newspapers, asking them about peace. Soon the idea of peace and talking about peace and talking to the enemy, soon it became possible. I wrote my book, a book about my life, recommending an end to war, recommending talks before armed struggle. And so, in the course of a few years, persons in the IRA listened to these arguments and generated their own arguments, perhaps from my arguments, and we began a peace process. It's a strange business to look back on life and see that I was bombing for 5 years, trying to kill soldiers and trying to bomb cities. And then looking back at 14.5 years in prison, it's a strange business to come back into the world. But always and everywhere I remember, and people remind me, that I was a freedom fighter or a terrorist. The fact is, if I was a freedom fighter, we used the technique of terrorism widely. But you know, it's difficult to come to terms with. Every single day, every single evening, nearly every hour of my life, I remember the war, and I remember my part in the war. I never forget the 5 years of conflict and struggle. I never forget my victims. They're in my mind every day. I never forget my young comrades or friends who gave their lives rather foolishly when we were 16, 17, 18 years of age. I never forget our enemies that we killed. Young police officers, young soldiers. They're in my mind every day. There's like a world occurring in my mind that I carry with me every day from the past. What have I learned? What can I give? How can I justify to victims that I continue a normal life? How can I justify seizing a normal life with my past? I'm not sure. I am sure that I learned some lessons from the war. All young men have the romance of weapons and fighting and heroism and martyrdom. It's hard to eradicate these from the minds of young men. Only the passage of time and the role of victims and the horror of war changed us. In my case, I'm glad I was in prison for 14 years. It helped me to grow as an individual and become the person I am. There are some lessons of my life that I share with young people in colleges and schools and universities. It's never too late to turn back from doing evil. It's never too late to try to make a new life. It's never too late to apologize and say, I'm sorry for the wrong I have done. I am sorry for the wrong I have done, and I hope every day of my life contributes to the good.